it is time for the next talker by Kristian Roberts, CEO and Managing Partner at Nordicity. And he's going to talk about why audience is the only thing in parentheses and how to get it. So let's welcome him.
All right, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for sticking out till the end to hear me talk. I'm honored. But yes, I'm Kristian. I'm this guy. I'm the I'm a CEO and managing partner of a company called Nordicity. I'm based in Canada, and I've been working in the economics of the games industry since 2007. So that makes me old. My company does a lot of things, but we're a consulting firm, and I specialize in the social and economic impacts of games. I work with governments, do industry profiles, policy development, all that sort of stuff. And really, I'm here to talk about audiences, and really demonstrate how audience is not only the thing you should maybe strive for, but is really the only important thing for the success of any games company, particularly of indie games companies. But I'm an economist, so I need to start with context, and I'm an economist, so there are charts. Warning, if you are allergic to charts, this is where you run away. If you're like, no more numbers, I'm not for you. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is just the global games market, and of course it's despite all of the doom and gloom we may have heard over the last number of years, it is still growing year over year. People are still spending more money on games than they did last year, and that will be true next year as well. And importantly, the industry is itself global. It's not a Swedish industry, a Canadian industry, a German industry. It's one global industry. And we're all part of that industry. We're all part of a value chain of developers and publishers, platforms, players from around the world. So if we have to sort of conceive of that global mindset first. But really, it isn't one industry. We're a bunch of different industries. We have the console, mobile, PC. Mobile is, of course, still half of the industry in the world. But most people in the room, perhaps not all of you, but most people behind you are exhibiting one of these three things. PC games. And that PC game, the total market value is not the $200 billion that we, unfortunately, that we like to put into the news. It's this, like, 41.2 billion US dollars. I apologize for using US dollars, but I'm lazy, and Newzoo releases things in US dollars. So forgive my laziness. And so why do we, of course, focus on PC? Why do we end up in PC? Sure, it's a crowded marketplace, as we can see here, but it's way less crowded than mobile. Just last year alone in 2025, there was like 19,000 or just under 20,000 games released on Steam. It's a lot of games, but that's still half as much as were released on mobile. And those new games generated 30% of the revenue on Steam, so it's not bad, especially when you consider that it's only less than 5% of total revenue is made by new games in mobile. So we're all still playing Candy Crush years later, or at least enough people are. And the success rate reflects that, right? So if you put your game on Steam, there was about 300 games released on Steam that made over $1 million in revenue, which is roughly the same number on mobile, but of course there's way more games introduced. So your chances of success are still low because it's still hit-driven business, make $1 million bucks, but it's still way better than on mobile. And my little takeaway fact is, sorry, I covered it up for the guys who were taking pictures, so I apologize. But my little takeaway fact is that the top 50 mobile games in the world generate 93% of the money in mobile. So the rest of us are fighting for the 7% table scraps that is left. And then why do I have the Steam logo up here? Because Steam is about 75% of the market. There really isn't any good data on Steam's market share, but all the bad data seems to suggest it's somewhere between 75 and 80% of the market. Everything else is, itch.io, GOG, Epic, and so forth. And also, there's good data that you can get on Steam from SteamDB or I guess from Steam Spy before. And also, I'm a bit lazy, so I took all the data from them. So indies on Steam are competing head-to-head with AAAs and increasingly winning. So I did some math. Excellent, well done. So looking at the world since 2018, it was like a quarter of the money made on Steam was made by indie titles, and by that I mean titles made by fewer than 50 people, roughly more like 25-ish people. And last year, for the first time ever, by my count, it crested over 50%. So more than 50% of money on Steam is made by indie teams such as you, the folks exhibiting, all that sort of stuff. So let's do some quick math. What are we playing for? We're competing not only we're competing against not necessarily competing against AAA companies or console-based, but in the indie space, what are we all playing for? So let's start with the 21% of total revenue. That's that $41 billion I was talking about before. And let's pay our tax to Steam. We have to pay that tax, or as we good economists would call it, economic rent, but whatever. So that brings us down to about 28 billion. And then that 52%, $15 billion. 15 billion US dollars. All of everybody is competing for 15 billion. All indies in the world, that's the money that we're playing for. And so, it's a pretty good number. And this is the one, I'll stop here because this is the one you want to take a picture of because it's all on the slide. Good. Everybody, emerging ecosystems, established ecosystems that are protecting their market share, we're all competing for this money. But it's really important to remember, I've talked about money so far, but it's important to remember that this isn't $15 billion. It's not a pile of money that we're all just kind of running towards. It's actual people. These are actual human people with increasingly limited disposable income and with, as in my case, and I bet you all of your cases, really extensive Steam libraries of games you've never played or played a few hours of because they were fun and then you moved on to the next one. So you're competing with all the new games, but then all of the back catalog that you've maybe already bought or could also buy. And the bad news, of course, is that everybody else is going to compete for those dollars. So we're all here, talking with, we're in Europe having this conversation. I could have this conversation in Brazil. I could have this conversation in Southeast Asia, and I do. And they are also competing for this 15 billion US dollars. This is the reality and this is why, of course, at the fundamental basis, why audience is where our money comes from. It's really easy to forget this fact, that none of this matters if nobody buys, if nobody plays our games. So yeah, audience. So let's dig into more about what the audience is telling us. What is the audience telling us from Steam? So yes, what does the Steam data actually tell us? So competition, the first thing, quite obviously, is competition is fierce on Steam. So I mentioned that last year there was just under 20,000, there's about 20,000 games released on Steam. So I used to use this as a linear curve. I used to say there's more games released on Steam every year. It's kind of going up linear. So between 2020 and 25 was like 90% growth. And then something happened last year, and it starts to exhibit an exponential growth curve. And as we start thinking about the introduction of AI tools, things that make it easier to get games to market, that curve is only going to get steeper. So more of us are out there competing for the $15 billion, which is actually people's attention. And this also, however, there's a little bit of a good news in this. This includes what I would call true slop games, or games that were really never intended for commercial success. A good example, of course, is student games. At the end of most academic programs, the final deliverable, the final project is make a game. And it's almost always a kind of crappy 2D puzzle platformer that nobody ever wants to play. But it's not the point. The point was to ship a game. So the question then arises, are there too many games in the marketplace? Are we competing with each other for too many, for the same eyeballs too much? Maybe. And so just looking at this year, so this is where the projection on the previous slide comes from. It's from Chris Sikowski's howtomarketagame.com. And he's projecting that 26,000 games released on Steam in 2026 based on the numbers in the first quarter. But this is also the distribution in that quarter. And as you can see, over 60% of those games, after a few months after release, have fewer than 0 to 9 reviews. So let's assume that is the true slop games. So the good news is that 60% of the games released on Steam you're not actually competing with because they're not actually trying to be commercially successful. They're just there, true slop. And maybe, and I think that as a lot of the games produced, let's say in 10 minutes by AI get on the market, a lot of them will still end up in this pocket. But what is also true, that's based on reviews, is that less than 2%, so quite consistent with the previous number, have more than 1,000 reviews, are making significant money. And that number, as actually we've looked at that many years in a row, and that number is roughly consistently around 2%, right? I said that, as I said earlier. So there's a lot of competition for the middle, and most of us are going to end up in the middle between those two numbers. So again, that's where our sweet spot generally as indie game developers are. The other piece of data that I was looking at this year, just to help to give some hope to the room, is that headcount does not to make a successful game. So I asked myself, is there actually any correlation, because again, math nerd, between the number of people who made a game and the revenue potential of those games? So there's the answer is decisively no. Anybody who understands R² will recognize that the correlation of 0.3 is like is a weak correlation. And then I was like, wait a minute. What's that dot up there in the corner? What's that one? Right there in the corner. That's Battlefield 6. So let's see, what if I was like correct for not Battlefield 6? Other than Battlefield 6, is there any relationship? And the answer is super no. So the good news is that you don't actually need big teams to make big money. The math says so. This is based on the top 100. This is the top 100 Steam games in 2025. So the payoff for bigger teams can be really high. The other thing we looked at when we looked at the Steam games, looked at the sort of what audiences are spending their money on, is that when I adjust revenue per head, so it's just kind of the same logic, you can see that on a per head basis, indie teams or smaller teams of like 0 to 50 people generate the most revenue per head. So it drops off quite precipitously thereafter. And that's good, because that means, like, from an investment perspective, smaller teams are more capital efficient, is what we would call it in economic terms. So again, these are good data to put in your pitch decks. Like, my small team can make tons of money. And the average, of course, just what we're comparing to is the average across all categories and of teams, about $3 million per head in that top tier. And then I looked, okay, well, what if we self-publish? Like, how does that affect indie success on Steam? And it turns out that teams that self-publish, and I got to give a caveat here, teams that obviously self-publish. And what I mean by that is that what I can't correct for is publishing as a service, ghost publishers, because I just don't know. But where there was a difference between the name on Steam that says publisher and the name on Steam that says this is developer, self-published indies make about 600% more money, or 585% more money on their games. And it makes perfect sense, I think, right? Like, if you are always going to be your best salespeople, you know your game better, and you're connected with your own audiences. And sure, you can outsource that, but if you have the resources to do so, you'll probably do a better job, because again, they're your people, your audiences. I also look to see whether licensing IP, whether licensed IP is performing better or worse than other kinds of IP. So, like, Mickey Mouse games, or like Tom and Jerry. And it turns out, no. Developer-owned games, where the developer is creating new IP and putting it into the marketplace, performs better than whether the publisher owns the IP or licensed IP, especially when I adjust for headcount. So this is again, there's hope. It's very, very competitive, but there is hope for that audience. And so it might seem sometimes like an easy shortcut to say, I'll just go make a Mickey Mouse game, but ultimately, you're not as successful for your smaller teams, and as I will get into later, you're just generating more fans for Mickey Mouse and not for your studio. So back to Kristian from howtomarketagame.com. A little while ago, he had this idea called the Great Conjunction, which is the idea of a confluence of game genres that players want, that connect with what game developers can actually create. This is his graphic, not mine, so please, all credit due. But game developers can actually make relatively quickly and relatively more easily. So does that, this was about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, so does this world still exist? And the answer is probably. And particularly thinking about smaller teams, these are teams that are more adaptable, flexible, can sort of get to the right place at the right time. So smaller teams like most of us here are more able to continue this great conjunction. And what are these genres? Right now, simulation appears to be the most sort of emergent genre. And so this is again back to Zakowski. Telling us that 2 years ago simulation was on the top 10 list, but now these are the games that are being more successful on Steam. Again, without any correction for markets for team size, but this is where games are going now. And what I did is I said, okay, Chris, well that's Steam writ large, but what happens when I correct for team size, for indies, for talking to the actual people who are making these smaller games? So I mapped revenue to team size, and I split them apart into those indie, AA, AAA, and giant. And what we can see is that is like the math continues to suggest that smaller teams are able to create the kinds of games that fit into this great conjunction, that are the peaks of the world, the content warnings, the schedule ones, what have you. On the other end, it is almost impossible by virtue of looking at the data for smaller teams to be successful with first-person shooters or sports games. Just like the capital requirements appear to be too high. Okay, that's some background. That was all the background, guys. Now let's say I'll get into the real question. Was in this galaxy of slop, can the point is the original games can stand out and audiences are the hyperdrive that fuel company success. And I apologize for being a space nerd and using space references, but I'll get to that in a second. So before I move forward, I have to remind ourselves where does value from a games company come from? And to be clear, what I mean by games companies, I mean like companies that are making commercially oriented intellectual property. If you're making educational games or games that have more social impact purposes, this probably doesn't apply as well to you. And if you're a services company, again, not as well. But of course, as we said, it comes from audiences. Now, what do I mean by audiences when I say that? What I don't mean, first, is demographics. Because turns out men 18 to 35 or whatever is not a useful description of an audience, because there's no commonality between what those people like. So I bet you if we go through the room, we're all like vaguely, we go through find a similar demographic, or vaguely the same, and we like a lot of different games. So it's not a useful descriptor. So that's really what we're talking about is communities of interest. And in this case, we mean real people. Communities are real people who play real games, specific games, and in this case, on Steam. So that could be completionists with an affinity for 64-bit platformers. It could be parents looking for easy to pick up late-night gaming binges. People like flow states. People who like catching up over meme games, or space nerds. There's only one of these that isn't me. And it's the friends catching up over meme games, because I play games to not talk to people, not to talk to people. But fortunately, there is an audience for everything. So if we look at the space nerds, we could be space nerds that like, grand strategies, or spaceships, space nerds that like spaceship fights, space nerds that like flow state dismantling spaceships, particularly like breaking apart spaceships. Or more of that. So in making a successful game, we have typically thought of approaching these audiences in a very linear fashion. We make the game, we try to find the audience for that game, we make some revenue, and then one of three things happens. We make enough revenue, and that's the end of the line. We make no revenue, the end of the line, company folds. We make enough revenue to sort of gamble on the next project, or we make enough to turn that into real profit. And that's fine. We're just thinking about making a game. But ultimately, we want to make sustainable games companies. So do we want to make only one game? So success comes from this discrete audience, from that $15 billion of revenue that turns into actual people. And that's the real success, the bottom fork, almost never comes from the first game. Typically, it comes from game 2 or 3. This is the case with Power World, Expedition 33, Undertale, Over the Hill, or whatever. So how do we get there? How do we solve for sustainability that helps us get to those those other games? And as you might be able to tell right now, it's probably audience, because I keep coming back to that same word. So if you do approach things as all games being different, you kind of come back. Kind of game 1, and you come back to the origin point. You come back game 2, and you sort of everything is kind of shot in the dark, trying to get to the point where you can make a sustainable company, get over that break-even line. You haven't really built anything from game 1 to game 2. So a while ago, I thought to myself, okay, how can I explain from a value creation perspective what this should look like? And I thought, like, where is there a game to explain to a bunch of game makers how to do this? Is there any games that like we want to not start over every time and but you kind of have to take a new shot, and it's kind of a risk every time? Ah, yes, very good. And I was probably playing Vampire Survivors when I did this, and so like let's treat this as a roguelike approach. So let's imagine ourselves building a game for that same distinct audience, for the same audience group that, in this case, space nerds, me, the space nerd. And so I'm going to cultivate, and I'm going to take those audiences and cultivate them and retain them over the course, beyond that first game, carry over those audiences to game 2 and start leveraging building a brand identity or IP or a series of characters that I can take to the next game, and then build another game for that audience, and in turn create this sort of virtuous cycle that looks slightly roguelike-y. So again, we do it again, but better with upgrades. So again, just to put it in principles, game 1, we get a bunch of little audience tokens from this, our audience, because of course that is the currency. And we take those audience tokens to the shop. We recruit allies, new team members, because they like what our studio is doing. We hire mercenaries because we have some cash from those audiences. Remember, because that's where the $15 billion turns into. We forge weapons, buy maps, post flyers, make investments, but we're using the audience to continue to make our lives easier, like a roguelike. And then we have game 2, maybe we get a few more audience coins. Go back to the shop for game 3 and have lots more audience coins. So building this successful games company rather than just a successful game requires that focus on audience. So game 1, make some audience. Game 2, make some audience. Game 3, you can see this is a building on building on ourselves, and we're not running the roguelike on the hardest possible level every time, which is the first run at a roguelike. So the more fans we can accumulate over time, the more sustainable our studio is, and the more you can roll those fans over from one game to the next. So, I mean, that's great in theory, but let's provide a sort of practical example of what that might look like. And because I'm Canadian, and there's at least one more of me in the audience, I will use a Canadian example. My friends over at Fun Selector. So they made a game in 2015 called Absolute Drift. I sold 250,000 units, $12 a pop. So it made 1.4 million US and 1.4 million in revenue. And then rather than a sequel, they kind of took the sort of vibe and essence of their first game and brought it over to the second game, released in 2020. Again, it's still car themed, so it's still appealing to the same kind of audience, still kind of got a chill, lo-fi vibes. Sold just under 200,000 units, $25 a pop. So again, able to command a little bit more dollars. Very difficult game. And then they were able to then continue to build on this audience from game over game to game 3. Over the Hill, which is still yet to be released, it should come out in December of this year if everything goes well. And it was able to leverage this audience to create over 1 million wish lists. Now, of course, they need to convert on that, but still 1 million wish lists is pretty good. I like the mud runner like over off-roader as a good description of this. But again, it's not a sequel, but it's the same audience. You're appealing to people who like driving cars in a chill flow state, and lo-fi beats. So again, this is us building that's them building value in their company from game to game to game in terms of their audience. So I want to take another moment of involuntary economics lessons for you all and explain where company valuations come from. As again, we're talking about building this enterprise value. And in general, like enterprise value comes from the ability to predict what future revenue you're going to generate in your company. And that can be from the skills and talents of your team, from intellectual property that people will still care about, sustained market interest, which is sort of people buying your existing products, or consumer goodwill. This is the brand value. So if you put somebody else's name on it, would it sell less? And the example, of course, in the games industry, we can easily call to is something like Supergiant. Supergiant puts out a game, we're probably going to give it a look because it's a Supergiant game. If it was any other name, we might not be as inclined to give it a look. So for indie game companies, so let's translate that into the language of indie games. If audience is the thing we're trying to solve for, it's the skills that we need teams with the skills and ability to actually generate those audiences. We need intellectual property that audiences actually care about and have connected to. The characters, the sort of, I mean, the best example, of course, is the value that was created, or a very good example of value created in the Hitman character, which was 45% of the value of IO when it was sold. A continuing relationship with the affinities with existing products. People are still buying your existing game. And the brand ethos is the sort of Supergiant effect. So essentially what I'm saying is that audience is the value of your company, and your company's job is to generate audience, to create value through the cultivation of those audiences. So that's all kind of well and good and interesting for me to talk about, but what does this actually look like in practice? And so I've talked about why audience, the title of the talk is Why Audiences Are Everything, and hopefully you will now understand why that is true, but how do we go about getting them? And I can't answer obviously all of that in the context of a talk, and of course it's going to be different for all of you in some ways, but there are some general guidelines, and we'll obviously get into this more in questions. So first is choose wisely. Pick platforms and genres you can actually succeed on. So like mobile, as I talked about earlier, probably difficult to jump into those audiences given that you're trying to compete with people who are spending billions of dollars on user acquisition, or to put it otherwise, audience acquisition and retention. So yeah, Steam probably a better bet than mobile. It's also true, like if you're gonna have like systemic games, things that pull audiences in are probably gonna be easier for you to retain those audiences than something like short linear games that I can simply watch on Twitch and therefore never actually join your community and never really be part of your audience. And then just because I have to say it, like please don't make puzzle platformers because there is no audience for them. Doesn't exist. You can't get it because it doesn't exist. And then of course you need to, in order to get audiences, you need to actually talk to people. We must all escape from our basements and go out into the world and talk to people because that's where the audience is. It's not in our basements. And I mean that, virtually talk to them. And the earlier you can get to those audiences, the earlier you can start creating value in your company. And ideally, it's a lot easier if you are part of the audience, if they are part of you. So it's much harder. If you try, I'm a space nerd, and if you try to sell me a space nerd game and you're not, I will find out because it will be obvious. And there, if you cannot authentically connect with that audience, you probably can't cultivate them. And so go and find them where they live. Where do space nerds hang out? The answer is probably on Reddit, Star Wars forums, complaining about something about Star Wars, which is our favorite pastime as Star Wars nerds. And then find ways to retain those audiences between your releases. Of course, you can't always, that's not going to always be more games necessarily, but, keep talking to them, keep engaging them. There's, that could be through, updating them on progress in new games, the ideas you're coming up with, and help them into that process. Or non-game content. I mean, maybe that's your audience is also like comic books, and you want to partner with a online comic creator for some non-game content. And then, when you do get to that next game, as I was sort of alluding to with the fun selector example, spiritual successors are a better option for you than sequels, because you're actually, giving your audience something new and not just feeding them the same thing with a 2 on it. And then, of course, I'd like to say run an actual business and try to stay as small as possible, because as I alluded to earlier, there's no relationship between the size of your company and the potential for you to reach those audiences. And I don't know why the builds were backwards. And treat those audiences as you would product development. You can't only have audience development or product development. You need both. Because again, if you just make a product and you have no audience, you're not going to get that $15 billion. If you have just audience and no product, you have nothing to sell. So smaller teams are more capital efficient, as I talked about earlier, which also makes it easier for you to say, here's my small investment and my giant audience. It's much more a compelling argument to people with money. And don't think that the success of your firm is going to depend on scale, in terms of audience scale, or sorry, your team scale. And perhaps most importantly, recognize that those audiences, because remember, that's your ability to generate value in your company, are the primary strategic asset in your firm, in your company. Again, this is if you want to make a company, you just want to make one game, fine. But if you're trying to make a sustainable company, this is where that value comes from. This is where your sustainability comes from. So don't give them up easily. Be jealous, which is to say, you probably want to self-publish and not give up those audiences to somebody else. And then finally, as I showed with the numbers, recognize that you will always be the best ambassador to your audience, that you're also part of that audience. So also self-publish. So thanks very much. I think we have some time for questions. I want as difficult questions as possible. We got one over here, I think.
So you showed examples of revenue by self-published indie games versus not self-published.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any correlation of how many of those games are successful? Would games have been successful if they had a publisher? It's like, are the results biased towards those few who skew the results, if that makes sense?
Well, as it turns out, the data set was equal. There was the same number of self-published and not self-published games in the data set. So it was the same. It was equal. But there will be survivor bias in the data set. But I think that survivor bias doesn't dispute the results. It means that the way I interpret that is those companies or those studios who can self-publish are more likely to succeed. And so those that can't are more likely to work with a publisher, and so they will they're just not it's not as effective a audience development plan.
So on the self-publish, I guess a lot of indie studios are maybe in a position where they maybe want to self-publish, but they can't really get there, and they maybe need funds to finish the thing. And if they don't want to work with a publisher, or any specific advice to those kind of
Yeah, I mean, it's a super good point, and that's the reality. The reality is that quite often, you don't have the skills or money. So I think that the earlier you can get the evidence. Okay, I got a few answers to the questions. So I'm trying to answer them. So the first thing is, not everybody with money is a publisher. So you might need money to finish your game, and so getting evidence to support to get that extra money will come from some self-publishing activity, and even the evidence you need to get publishing will come from that self-publishing activity. So I think as you conceive of your game, you want to get to that evidence as quickly as possible. So sometimes that's even like a fake gameplay trailer, just see if there's some traction on YouTube or something. But the fastest you can get to what is called the real evidence, so your engagement on your Discord, because again, that's not costly, or more ideally, like getting playtest reactions and significant playtime on those playtests, sort of 45 minutes to an hour. Then you start to have some evidence that can unlock the rest of the money in order to sort of continue to self-publish. But yeah, I mean, what it means is that your sort of strategic priority should be, how fast can I get that evidence, and how little money can I spend with as few people as possible on my team to get the evidence for that traction, because that's then what unlocks the rest of the money. So it comes in some ways that comes down to team formation. And I think that one of the principal challenges that we're facing is that we went into the industry thinking that I'm just going to go make games. When reality is, if I'm going to make a game studio, from day one, I have to think about, I need to make games and audience. As I said, you can't have one without the other. And just to give what does that look like in practice? The example I always like to use is Innersloth. The first non-founder hire was the head of marketing, and I think that's. I mean, obviously it's a unicorn to some degree, but that mindset of we need to build community from day one as important as a programmer. So I think as we're building our teams, we can't think of the community manager or the head of marketing, whatever, as somebody we hire later when we have some product. It's day one. It's like a day one hire. So it's a little bit of team formation and a little bit of speed to evidence, and it's a lot easier to get to evidence when you have those abilities in-house. All right, we got a question over here.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, do you see benefits to building an audience during development already through open development?
Yeah. I mean, yes. The short answer is yes, but there's always going to be a balance between open development and allowing the community between taking community feedback and allowing the community to dictate your game. So, I mean, the product still needs to be your voice, but it also needs to be a voice that somebody is willing to listen to. So there's that creative balance, and there's no magic formula to doing it. It's sort of like some communities will be more vocal, want more and provide more feedback, and some of that will be useful and not. But I think some nature of open development or some interaction with your audience is really good. And again, I think that playtesting is one of those times when that becomes real. And I think playtesting is also quite interesting because you can start playtesting different features of your game, and it kind of becomes more of it's like audience feedback plus marketing. Because hey, look, I added the bugle to my to my game this week. Come play the bugle, and then next week I added the trombone, and so I think you can use open development both as marketing and as real real development. And I think playtesting is a kind of efficient means of doing so.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh, one more.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if you have you have an idea of an audience, or you have already validated in person, but you don't know where online you would find those people. How would you go about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a lot easier, as I said, if you are part of that audience, right? Because you know where you go to find out things from whatever games you like to play. And if you don't like reading anything about games you like to play, then maybe talk to your friends who also like to play them. But I think that's why I think that the easiest audience to sell to is your own audience. It's also the easiest audience to make authentic connections with. And this whole audience focus works because you're attempting to make authentic connections with that audience. So quite often, just to expand on that a little bit, quite often we overcorrect. People listen to my talk and they're like, cool, I'm going to go to Game Discover Co. and I'm just going to make games for the most popular audience, and they're going to make a horror cozy horror game because that's what's selling. But if I'm not a cozy horror fan, I'm not going to make a good cozy horror game because I don't know the medium. So I think again, you still have to be authentically connected to those audiences in order to know what works for them. So again, do you know where you hang out?
Let me follow up on that. I guess so. For me, it's people who do puzzle books, and I've shown the game to people who do that. I also enjoy that, but they don't usually go online to play games, but they are enjoying.
Oh, that's difficult. Then you've given yourself a difficult task, because how to market to people who are not in places where you can market to is a difficult task. So perhaps you have limited your market potential a little bit. So I don't know. Maybe that's we'll have to follow up on that one, because I think it's a good question. But mostly you will know where your audiences are and how to read where you are, because that's where you hang out. Any last thoughts? All right. Hearing none, I will thank you all for sticking out to the end. It's 5:30 on the last day, so well done, guys. Congratulations to you all. And go off and find your audiences.